You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 436 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I got the second half of the year-end review. This will be the final show of 2019. On the previous show, I kind of went through the big news stories from the past year on Russia, North Korea, Iran, and China. On today's show, I plan to do that about Afghanistan, the Middle East wars, and then some stuff that's happened in the past year in Africa. Really trying to cover what the Trump's foreign policy has been and looking at if it's making us less safe, where, you know, in the last show, and especially with all those wars, the obvious answer was yes, while Trump puts forward this America First foreign policy saying that what he's doing is for the benefit of Americans. It's not the practical result of the foreign policy, and many times doesn't even seem like the real intent. So, share the show online, Libertarian Institute. Make sure you check out that site. I am the news editor there, and in that role, I put out the daily news roundup that's featured on the homepage. When you see that right side column on the homepage, scroll down. The daily news roundup's the first thing at the top. About halfway down, you'll find the show and share it from there. If you're a new listener to the show, subscribe to it somewhere. It's on all the podcast apps and stuff like that. There's also a Libertarian Institute all podcast feed where you can find the show. And last, if you want to donate to the show, you can do that at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. All right, so starting in Afghanistan, and you're not going to get this if you don't, listen to Foreign Policy Focus or the Scott Horn Show or, are regularly at antiwar.com or the Libertarian Institute. But it's been an extremely deadly year in the Afghan war, while it's captured almost no news stories. So I think that should be the biggest theme and takeaway from Afghanistan the past years. It's been an extremely bloody year for civilians. At least 3/4 of the way through the year, the U.S. was still out killing civilians as compared to the Taliban. And the crazy thing is for a good part, if not a majority of this past year, the U.S. has been engaged in negotiations with the Taliban, taking steps towards a peace deal. Now, the beginning of September, it looked like we were really close to making talks. There was this story about maybe a potential meeting between Trump and the Taliban at Camp David, either right on or around 9/11. The Hutts in the administration used this to blow up the potential meeting between the U.S. and Taliban, if it was even going to exist. However, American soldier was killed around this time, and then Trump used that to call off talks altogether. So then we went the past 2 months with really no talks between the United States and the Taliban. We have Mike Pompeo coming out saying the U.S. had carried out a massive round of airstrikes, killing thousands of Taliban members. Who knows how many civilians. But, within the past month, talks have gotten restarted, and now I just read today at antiwar.com that the Taliban are agreeable to a ceasefire around the signing of a peace deal with the United States. So it does seem like we're moving in the right direction towards a peace deal. The problem is there's still more troops in Afghanistan than when Trump took office. And so evaluating from the American first position, when as a candidate, Trump said, at times, and at other times he had other things to say, that, American troops in Afghanistan are beneficial to Americans and we need to take them out. And that's absolutely the case. It's definitely making the Americans, I think the 20 or so now that have died in Afghanistan in the past year, it makes them less safe, but it also killing all these civilians overseas, wreaking all this havoc and all this destabilization. It's probably more beneficial to the terrorists than a complete U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan would ever be. Well, that I'm pretty sure that is more beneficial to the Taliban, or the terrorists, excuse me, not the Taliban, than a complete U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan ever would be, as far as being able to wage Osama bin Laden's jihad against the United States. So, it's definitely been a folly for that angle. We also had the drug war continuing in Afghanistan and failing in 2019. This is nothing new and no surprise. We've gotten numbers on the number of Afghan soldiers, government soldiers backed by the U.S. that are dying. They can't replenish their ranks fast enough, so it is not a very good war on their part. They're also killing a lot of civilians. I'm not quite sure if they're outpacing the Taliban as well, but, the U.S. is. And as I've been saying through the whole year, that this is all for nothing. And, that's not an original idea of mine. I have to give credit to, Scott Horton and pretty much everybody else in the alternative media who, for probably a decade or more have been against this war and explaining how it can't be won. So that's why, when a couple weeks ago the Afghanistan papers came out, for me, there wasn't like a whole lot of groundbreaking stuff in there other than that the government knew that this was the case the whole time. And so, I guess it's been amazing to see that even with these Afghanistan papers being published by the Washington Post, along with the fact that it's been an extremely bloody year and it hasn't been reported, we now see that Afghanistan still can't get in the public discussion when there's peace talks going on with the Taliban. We had these Afghanistan papers coming out proving that this war was a lie all along. And Congress isn't taking up that issue. I mean, I know everybody's very distracted by, come out during the holiday season and then there's impeachment. But still, it seems like this should be a big deal for all these people who have, been parroting the Pentagon and the U.S. government's line the whole time that we're rounding the corner of Afghanistan, that we're finally winning that war. Turns out that was never the case, right? In all 18 years of this war, it's been a failure after failure after failure. Can't identify the enemy. We got so much money in the country, we don't know how to spend it. We have the fact that there's never been a strong government in Kabul. We're just fighting a losing battle against trained tradition and the Taliban. And again, this doesn't enter the public discussion, even when the Washington Post, a major, mainstream, acceptable reporting kind of newspaper, releases all these documents from generals saying that this war isn't working. All right, I should move on from Afghanistan. I could spend, another 10 minutes ranting about how nobody pays attention to it, but let's get on to Syria, when if you listen to this show, last year, maybe even, in the episode right at this time, I was very optimistic going into 2019 about Syria. And that's because Trump had announced U.S. troops would be withdrawn. Now, I wasn't on the show saying the great mighty emperor Donald Trump said U.S. troops should come home, so I think they're going to come home very quickly. But the president did publicly announce that U.S. troops are coming home. So I was very hopeful that something at least similar to that, maybe we stay at Al-Tanaf and we continue to back rebels along the border between Syria and, Turkey, Iraq, Jordan. But at the same time, at least we're scaling down this conflict a little bit. That's really not what happened. Throughout most of the year, it didn't seem like U.S. troops are scaling down at all. We had reports that they had actually added 1,000 troops. So we are up to 3,000 troops, and those were to position the U.S. to withdraw. By midsummer, I mean, it seemed to me that people were saying there was less than 2,000 troops in Syria. Who knows how true that is? And then in the beginning of October, we have reports that U.S. troops are about 1,000 in Syria. And at that time, they were still in this area of northwest Syria that was occupied by the Syrian Kurds. They controlled it after the U.S. helped them liberate it from ISIS. And our NATO ally Turkey wanted to remove the Syrian Kurds from that area. And so finally, this has been cooking on the boiler since 2014 or 2015 when Obama started backing the Syrian Kurds. Turkey has been threatening this the whole time. They finally say, we're going ahead with the invasion. Donald Trump says the U.S. troops will get out of the way. And again, there's some optimism that, hey, U.S. troops are coming home. It seems like if we're not going to defend the Kurds, which is the reason the U.S. troops are there right now, then we're going to withdraw. However, enter, I believe, retired General Jack Keane to the White House with some maps, and he uses these maps to convince Donald Trump that, well, Donald, rather than taking all the U.S. troops out of Syria and bringing them home and carrying out your American first foreign policy, why don't you stay for the oil? And so now we have, they say 650 troops in Syria defending the oil fields there. This is, really problematic, and it puts the American troops in a dangerous position. And of course, it's not profitable. There's a great article this fall at Anti-War by Ron Ensweiler going into the numbers here and just showing how there's no way the U.S. could ever make a profit on this oil. Also, the U.S. stealing that oil is even in the, international law, which is largely written and dominated by the West and crime. And so no U.S. oil companies can really engage in taking that oil anyways. As much as the U.S. will continue to say that we're staying in Syria as well to prevent ISIS from taking the oil and suggesting that there's a rise of ISIS, it does seem that at this point, if the U.S. kind of handed control or left Syria and allowed, kind of as happened, Russian and Syria forces to move into these areas, that's going to prevent ISIS from coming back. And it's going to, I think, prevent future geopolitical conflicts between Syria and Turkey over trying to get these Turkish soldiers out of Syria once they've already invaded. And another similarity to Afghanistan, I think the biggest story in Syria all year has been pretty much uncovered by the U.S. media, and there's really been no public discussion on it whatsoever. And that is the leaks from the OPCW on the Duma report. April of 2018, chemical weapons alleged attack in Duma as the Syrian government was trying to remove the last rebels from outside of Damascus, as these rebels were, shelling and killing civilians trying to live in the capital city of Syria. So one night there's heavy bombing going on. People start showing up at a local hospital, struggling to breathe. And some people around start yelling gas, 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 and dousing everybody with water. I guess this is what you would do in response to a gas attack. And then later evidence surfaced claiming to show a chlorine gas canister dropped by an Assad helicopter landing on a building there and suffocating over a dozen people, I believe, in a building with chlorine gas. So this is the narrative put forward at the time. The U.S., France, and the U.K. immediately seize on it and carry out, I think, 100 or so strikes against Syrian government targets. A major war crime committed there, and claiming it's in response to this chemical weapons attack by Assad. So after a couple weeks, Assad has retaken this territory, and the OPCW, the Organization for the Prevention of Chemical Weapons, gets into Duma, and they go inspect the site with this fact-finding team. Now, over time, reports come out. People go like Robert Fisk and do some original reporting. And me and Will Porter, really, I gotta say, have covered this very well on the show. He's probably been on 5 to 10 times. I'm guessing that number's close to 10, talking about this particular attack. And, one of the things we discuss is Robert Fisk's great reporting over there, where he went and talked to the doctors, and they say, well, there's really no evidence of a chlorine gas attack. People just start yelling gas, 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 and this is how we responded. This is, further backed up by the fact-finding team. But to talk about what happened in 2019 is a series of leaks that came out of the OPCW, basically showing that the report's conclusion, which again, me and Will debunked on this show, was terrible. The report essentially, without blaming Assad directly, I believe, said that, chlorine gas canisters were dropped from helicopters onto Duma, and the evidence on the ground showed that there was chlorine used and that this killed several people. Well, it turns out that the people who actually went to Duma didn't conclude this at all, and concluded the narrative that, me and Will had been putting forward, that this was, I guess, not to say necessarily a false flag, because it doesn't seem like there was an initial attack. It was just a fabrication. That something that was made up, maybe unlike the 2013 attack in Eastern Ghouta, where it seems like Syrian rebels gassed people living under them in order to, provoke a reaction from the international community against Assad. This time they just seem to have fabricated some propaganda, and a lot of people fell for it. So the fact that this hasn't been covered more is very disturbing. Caitlin Johnstone has a great article, and again, this is a person who's done an excellent job of covering this throughout, saying that, we have several scandals going on here. One, the OPCW was pressured by the United States to come to conclusions that supported premature U.S. airstrikes in Syria. All the scandals going on with these leaks coming out, showing that people in the OPCW caved to the Americans. And now the fact that nobody's covering this, and we actually have a journalist who had to resign from Newsweek in order to cover this issue. So, there's a lot going on there. Overall, it doesn't make America less safe to go around the world bombing countries on false pretexts. It would seem to be something that anybody who really hated America could use to rally people against us. It's also costly, dragging Americans into unnecessary war and killing, unnecessary people. Getting on to Iraq now, where maybe going into 2019, a little bit more optimism, but, corruption, reform, and all that doesn't happen. Starting in October, you have massive protests, 450 or so killed in, I think, over 6 weeks of protest. There's a little bit of gap in between. But this eventually leads to the prime minister resigning. There's a great recent episode of Around the Empire where Joanne Leone interviews Elijah Manier, who's a longtime reporter from the Middle East and has talked to all these, long-standing Iraqi officials over decades and really understands what's going on in that country. And he says that these protests are led by young people, and they are something of kind of political neophytes and really don't understand what to do politically. And this is allowed for the protesters to take a lot of missteps and make a lot of mistakes. But overall, this isn't something where there's a certain political element fueling it. It's just young people who feel like they have no hope in life because the country is so poor, so corrupt. You have people living in cities near oil fields that produce a massive amount of oil, and yet they don't have electricity and sewage because the country is so corrupt and all the money is being stolen. So now Iraq has made one election reform that was demanded by the protesters. However, the prime minister that was, I guess, put up by the parliament was not necessarily rejected by the president of Iraq, because I think the president, in somewhat of a ceremonial role, endorses the parliament's decision for prime minister. The person that's been put up for prime minister does not meet the demands of the protesters and doesn't want the protests to continue. So we have this tension in Iraq between the protesters and the people in the leadership, especially the Shia protesters and the Shia leadership. And of course, there's the role of the U.S. and Iran there, as they're the major players, in the country internationally. But at the same time, you had these conflicts between the U.S. and Iran, and I want to get to this a little bit. So throughout the year, there's been various attacks on Iraqi bases that house U.S. soldiers. And for a long time, the U.S. has been warning and pointing the finger at Iran for this, saying that they're Iranian-backed forces. Recently, a U.S. contractor was killed and a U.S. troop was wounded in one of these attacks. The U.S. again blamed this Iranian-backed forces. The Kettabab, I may be pronouncing that completely wrong, Hezbollah group is the one blamed, saying that this Shia militia backed by Iran carried out this attack. The U.S. then went and bombed this group in 3 locations, 2 in Syria, 1 in Iraq, claiming to have killed 4 commanders and 25 people in total, and wounding more than 50. The U.S. says this is a response to, attacks against American bases. You have Pompeo and others come out and call this successful. No word on it from Trump yet. So the first thing you had to wonder is where they had the authority to attack this group. This is a Shia-backed militia, so it's the enemy of the Islamic State in Iraq, a group that was fighting on the same side as the U.S. side throughout the anti-Islamic State operations in that country. And so, question mark there how, they get authority. Now, do you think Congress will bring this forward? Probably not, right? I think there's a pretty low chance that Congress says, oh, Donald Trump's abusing his presidential authorities for this, and they continue just to attack him over this Ukraine gate and Russia gate nonsense. But I do think this is something to worry about going forward into 2020, the conflict between Iran and the U.S. escalating in Iraq. In Yemen, much like Syria and Afghanistan, the war continues without much media attention or fanfare, probably even a little bit less this year, just because the Saudi war crimes have been so terrible in the past that anytime they're not blowing up a bus full of children, they're not getting a whole lot of media attention. I think the big story involving Yemen this year was the attack on the major Saudi oil facility in September that for a couple weeks really slowed down Saudi's oil production capabilities and was done by cruise missiles, bypassed Saudi air defenses. Of course, Iran is alleged to have been involved, but I think the understanding is that the Houthis, the party in Yemen that the Saudis are warring against, were at least involved in the attack. They claimed responsibility for the attack. So some people say, oh, the Iranians set it up to have this launch from Yemen. All the same, the Houthis were a necessary component of this attack if they just didn't carry it out themselves. This attack on the Saudi oil facility seemed to be enough for Saudi Arabia to now realize that this war is not benefiting them. It's making them less safe, and that the Houthis are increasing their military capabilities and are able to hit significant Saudi targets at this point. Because of that, I think Mohammed bin Salman and the Saudis really felt like they had to scale down this a little bit. Now, I think the Khashoggi affair also has similar impact, where because Jamal Khashoggi, a Washington Post writer, was important enough to receive international attention when he was murdered at the Saudi consulate in Turkey, I guess is how you would say it. And then Erdogan was able to leak out the murder plot as he did. Mohammed bin Salman, his top advisor, obviously being involved in the plotting, I guess made it so that he didn't need to make himself more of a pariah this year about bombing too many Yemeni civilians. However, it did continue. They say 800 or so civilians died just in the city of Hadida this year. Within the past week or so, 3 Saudi airstrikes across Yemen killed 17 civilians. Of course, the Houthis are not the good side in all of this and have their own problems, including using young soldiers, which it happens on the Saudi side. They have child soldiers from Sudan fighting within their ranks. The Houthis use a lot of landmines and snipers, and this rats up civilian casualties, not quite at the rate that Saudi bombs do, but at the same time, they're still guilty of war crimes and killing civilians. For the most part, it seems like the blockade is continuing with some humanitarian assistance getting in, but generally the country is being starved backwards, more people in the need of humanitarian assistance this year than last year. But you just want to know because it's not something that's covered in the press. And, when the Afghanistan papers can't get attention, that means that there's very little hope for Yemen. There were some positive steps, some ceasefire, some prisoner exchanges, but overall, I think that's still overshadowed by the war going on there. All right, Somalia, the trend continues in that not much media coverage of it the past year. In fact, it's really hard to know how many airstrikes were even carried out there last year compared to years past, just because the Pentagon doesn't seem to admit it, and who knows if the CIA is carrying out any drone strikes in that country. Strikes target between Al-Shabaab and ISIS, although civilians are often killed. The reporting from the government is always that no civilians were killed, although if any journalists on the ground are able to, get to any people and talk to them, they usually find that civilians were murdered. The Trump bombings have definitely been an escalation over the Obama bombings that, killed a lot of civilians and were discussing themselves. But it's becoming worse. And a recent terrorist attack in Mogadishu, as of recording this now, I don't know if any group has claimed responsibility yet. Most people look at Al-Shabaab, but 90 people killed in a massive truck bombing. Now, there was a far worse one in October of, I believe, 2017, where over 600 people were killed. But it seems very similar and very disturbing all the same. Yemen, like Somalia, again, making Americans less safe for this blowback reason and just wasting our money on these needless wars, destabilizing regions that don't need to be destabilized. All right, the last country I want to do in detail here is Libya, where Haftar, at least if you're looking at the geography, so you have two opposing governments. You have the UN recognized government, and then the Haftar government took a lot of territory. Oil fields, consolidates some control over southern Libya, and was able to put pressure and start an offensive for the capital city, Tripoli. So far, the Yemeni government has been able to hold out. Libya's largest city, I believe, is Tripoli, and the second largest is Marista. And these two cities continue to be controlled by the UN-recognized government. There's a lot of international involvement here, and that really complicates things. So you have Haftar backed by Egypt, Saudi, UAE, France, and Russia. And then you have the UN-recognized government that's, at least in name, backed by the US. And then strongly backed by Italy for immigration issues and Turkey because Erdogan has cut this sweetheart deal that, he now claims he made it with this government that controls a small chunk of Libya, and they split the Eastern Mediterranean Sea into waters controlled by Turkey and Libya. So the agreement by Erdogan's absurd. Nonetheless, he now has a lot of not responsibility, but reason to kind of defend that government in Syria. You have Chinese-made UAE-operated drones fighting on behalf of Haftar, killing civilians. And on the other side, you have drones. I'm not sure if they're operated or just sold to Libya by Turkey, but Turkish drones killing civilians on the other side. Turkey has definitely poured in some armored vehicles and other weaponry as well. This is a terrible situation for Libyans. It's putting more stress on the country and an infrastructure, making it more poor. They have this, I'm not a fan of welfare projects, but Gaddafi engaged in a major state welfare project that pumps all the water from the aquifers in the south of the country up to the north where the people live. They call it the Great Man-Made River because it was just such an amazing kind of undertaking and project that really helped to increase the wealth of Libya. And, these are being now leveraged in war efforts and also destroyed, shutting off parts of again, this Great Man-Made River. As well as the war, between the governments there, the U.S. is also bombing the Islamic State, and likely creating some more blowback from us. Other blowback from, the war in Libya, consequences of it. Mali, there's been hundreds of deaths there, if not thousands this past year, including the death of a dozen or so French soldiers and civilians that were killed in these ethnic cleansings, scores of people at a time. Similar situations in Burkina Faso where you had various militant groups often radicalized, as a result of the war in Libya back in 2011 and, kind of the terrorism and ideology that spread from there, have definitely killed and slaughtered hundreds of civilians. These attacks have also occurred in Niger and Chad. Also in the past year in Chad, you had a coup attempt stopped by the French after they carried out an airstrike against a convoy of coup plotters headed for the Chadian capital. Two more countries I just want to mention real quick. In Sudan, they have overthrown the leader there, Bashir, the dictator of 30 years, and are working on forming some kind of new government. It seems to be shaky, but maybe moving in the right direction. I think that'll be a country and region to watch in 2020. And then the Congo, where there's been an ongoing Ebola outbreak for the past couple of years. Now 2,200 lives have been claimed in the outbreak. One of the problems is that the Ebola treatment facilities keep coming under attack. At the start of October, the government began a campaign to target militant groups, particularly this group called the ADF. And the ADF has responded by targeting civilian targets and these Ebola centers and making that crisis far worse. It's, I guess, difficult to listen to this whole show because I feel like I only had negative things to say. In a lot of cases, all the expectations that I had going into 2019 for optimism were quashed by the war state. And, it was pretty bleak overall when you go back and you look at the news stories and you realize what's happening, that so many innocent people are dying and things are getting so much worse. But I kind of feel like the only thing I could do is keep bringing you the news. So that's what I plan to keep doing in 2019 and, that I did through 2019 and that I'll do in 2020. So I hope you really all are enjoying the show. Again, if you have anything from 2019 that I didn't cover, feel free to send me a message and I'll probably do something either more of like a review of the show or something in, for the show on the first show of the year, or maybe a look forward to 2020. But if you have any questions, feel free to send those over to me. You find me on Twitter at KYAAALE. Facebook, there's a private group, Foreign Policy Focus, libertarianinstitute.org, antiwar.com. And if you want to donate to me personally, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus.